"Mom died last night. We've got nobody left," whispered the orphaned girl through tears and dust. The Cahto healer looked into her desperate eyes and made a choice that would heal not just her broken family, but his own wounded spirit. Sometimes, salvation comes not from the medicine we brew, but from the love we're brave enough to offer. The Arizona territory stretched endlessly under a merciless August sun, its red earth cracked and thirsting for rain that hadn't come in 3 months. Heat waves shimmered off the desert floor like ghostly dancers, and even the buzzards seemed reluctant to take flight in the oppressive air. This was 1881, when the frontier still claimed lives with casual indifference, when survival meant more than just avoiding bullets and bandits. It meant outlasting the land itself. In a shallow canyon 15 miles north of Tucson, where ancient cottonwoods provided the only shade for miles, stood a modest adobe dwelling that seemed to grow from the earth itself. Smoke drifted lazily from its chimney despite the heat, carrying the scent of burning sage and something else, herbs that most white settlers couldn't name. Medicines that came from knowledge passed down through generations of Cahto healers. Nico, Earthwalker, moved with practiced quiet through his sanctuary, grinding willow bark with a stone pestle his grandmother had carved 60 years before. At 54, his hands were still steady, his black hair still thick, though now streaked with silver, that caught the light filtering through his single window. His face bore the weathered lines of a man who had seen too much suffering, yet his dark eyes held a gentleness that drew the wounded like water draws the dying. The adobe walls were lined with shelves holding glass jars and clay pots, each containing remedies for ailments both physical and spiritual. Dried plants hung in careful bundles from the ceiling beams, chamomile for calming, echinacea for strength, tobacco for ceremony. This was his world now, this quiet place where he could heal others while his own wounds remained carefully hidden beneath layers of purpose and solitude. Nico had not always been a hermit. Once, he had lived among his people in the mountains of Northern California, where the Cahto had dwelt for countless generations. He had been a respected healer even then, learning the old ways from his uncle while the world outside grew increasingly hostile to their traditions. He had been married to a woman named Morning Star, whose laughter could chase away the darkest sorrows, and they had been blessed with twin daughters who filled their lodge with joy. But the white man's diseases had found them even in their mountain sanctuary. Smallpox had swept through the village like wildfire, and Nico's healing knowledge, vast as it was, could not save his wife and children. He had tried everything, every herb, every ritual, every prayer he knew. He had stayed awake for days, grinding medicines and singing healing songs until his voice gave out. But one by one, the people he loved most had slipped away from him, leaving him alone with his grief and his terrible, useless knowledge. After burying his family, Nico had left his homeland and wandered south, carrying only his medicine bag and the weight of his failure. He had eventually settled in this canyon, drawn by its isolation and the presence of healing plants that grew wild near the hidden spring. For 7 years, he had lived here alone, treating whoever found their way to his door. Mexican vaqueros with broken bones, Apache warriors with infected wounds, desperate white settlers whose own doctors had given up on them. He asked for no payment beyond what people could spare, seeking only to keep his hands busy and his mind from dwelling on all he had lost. The afternoon heat was at its peak when Nico heard the sound that would change everything, the scrape of footsteps on stone, accompanied by quiet sobbing that seemed to echo off the canyon walls. He set down his pestle and moved to the window, his heart already beginning to race with the familiar urgency that came whenever someone approached his sanctuary in distress. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. 2 figures struggled up the rocky path that led to his dwelling, a girl who couldn't be more than 11 years old, carrying a smaller child on her back. Both were covered in trail dust, their clothes torn and stained with what looked like dried blood. The girl's auburn hair hung in matted tangles around a face streaked with tears and dirt, while the boy she carried appeared unconscious, his small body limp against her shoulders. Nico moved quickly to his door, his healer's instincts overriding. Years of carefully maintained solitude. The girl looked up as he appeared, her green eyes wide with exhaustion and desperate hope. She was clearly at the end of her strength, swaying on her feet as she fought to keep hold of her burden. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracked from thirst and crying. "My little brother's real sick, and I don't know what to do." Someone in Tucson said there was a medicine man up this way who might help folks like us. Nico reached out and gently lifted the boy from her back, feeling immediately how hot his small body was with fever. The child couldn't be more than 6 years old, his face flushed and his breathing shallow and rapid. Even without examining him closely, Nico could tell this was serious, probably dysentery or typhoid. Both killers on the frontier where clean water was often scarce. "Bring him inside," Nico said quietly, his voice rusty from disuse. He hadn't spoken to another person in nearly a month. "What are your names?" "I'm Hope Marie Carson," the girl said, stumbling as she followed him into the cool interior of the adobe. "This is my brother Tommy. He's been sick for 3 days now and he just keeps getting worse." Nico laid the boy on his own bed, noting how the child's lips were cracked and his skin had the papery feel of severe dehydration. He had seen this condition many times before, and he knew that without immediate treatment, the boy would not survive another day. Hope stood beside the bed, her hands clenched into fists at her sides, watching every movement with the fierce protectiveness of someone who had already lost too much. "Where are your parents?" Nico asked gently as he began gathering the medicines he would need. "Are they coming behind you?" Hope's face crumpled, and fresh tears began to flow down her cheeks. "Mom died last night," she whispered. "She got the same sickness as Tommy, but it took her real fast. Dad's been gone since spring. Got himself shot trying to rob a bank in Phoenix. We've got nobody left." The words hit Nico like a physical blow, bringing back memories of his own losses with painful clarity. He turned away from the girl's tear-stained face, busying himself with preparing a fever-reducing tea while his own emotions threatened to overwhelm him. Here was another family destroyed by the harsh realities of frontier life, another child forced to grow up too soon in a world that showed no mercy to the vulnerable. "How did you find this place?" he asked, needing to focus on practical matters to keep his composure. "This canyon is not easy to locate. We've been walking for 2 days, Hope said, settling into a chair beside the bed where her brother lay. "Started out heading for Tucson, but Tommy got too sick to travel far. Met an old Mexican man on the road who said there was a healer up in these parts. He drew us a map in the dirt and told us to follow the dry creek bed." Nico nodded, recognizing the description of Carlos Mendoza, an elderly vaquero who occasionally brought injured men to the canyon for treatment. Carlos was one of the few people who knew exactly where to find Nico's sanctuary, and he was careful about who he told. The fact that he had directed these children here meant he had seen something in them worth saving. As Nico worked to cool the boy's fever and get fluids into his dehydrated body, Hope told him their story in broken pieces. Their father, James Carson, had been a failed farmer turned desperate outlaw who had abandoned his family to pursue a life of crime. Their mother, Sarah, had struggled to raise 2 children alone while battling her own declining health. When illness struck both mother and son, Hope had done everything she could to care for them, but she was just a child herself with no knowledge of medicine or healing. "I tried to make her eat," Hope said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But she couldn't keep nothing down, and she just got weaker and weaker. Toward the end, she was talking to people who weren't there, her own mama and papa, who died when she was young. She kept saying she was sorry, that she should have done better by us." Nico felt his throat tighten as he listened to the girl's account. He recognized the guilt in her voice, the desperate belief that if she had just tried harder or known more, she could have saved her mother. It was the same guilt that had driven him into exile, the crushing weight of being a healer who could not heal the ones who mattered most. "Your mother's illness was not your fault," he said firmly, meeting Hope's eyes across the bed where her brother lay. "Sometimes sickness is stronger than all our efforts to fight it. What matters now is that you brought your brother here in time." Throughout the long afternoon and into the evening, Nico worked tirelessly to stabilize Tommy's condition. He brewed teas from willow bark and elderberry to reduce the fever, used chamomile and mint to settle the boy's stomach, and carefully spooned small amounts of herbal broths between his lips to restore the fluids his body had lost. Hope watched every movement with intense concentration, as if trying to memorize each technique and remedy. As darkness fell across the canyon, Nico lit oil lamps and continued his vigil beside the sick child. Tommy's fever had begun to break, and his breathing was becoming deeper and more regular, but he was not yet out of danger. Hope had fallen asleep in her chair, exhausted by days of travel and worry, her small hand still resting protectively on her brother's arm. Looking at the sleeping girl, Nico was struck by her resemblance to his own daughters at that age. The same determined chin, the same fierce loyalty to family that showed even in sleep. She had somehow managed to keep herself and her brother alive through their mother's death and their dangerous journey across the desert, displaying a strength and resourcefulness that would have impressed warriors twice her age. As the night wore on, Nico found himself thinking about the choice that lay before him. These children had nowhere to go, no family to take them in, no means of supporting themselves in a world that was hostile to orphans. The territorial authorities would likely separate them, sending Hope to work as a domestic servant and Tommy to an orphanage where he might or might not survive to adulthood. It was a fate that befell countless children on the frontier, and it rarely ended well. But what alternative could he offer them? He was a man who had chosen solitude, who had built his life around avoiding the kind of attachments that brought pain. His small adobe dwelling was not designed for a family, and his healing work often required him to travel to remote locations where children could not safely follow. More importantly, he was not sure he could bear to love again, knowing how easily love could be torn away by death and disease. Yet as he watched Tommy's small chest rise and fall with increasingly steady breaths, Nico felt something stirring in his heart that he had thought was dead forever. It was the desire to protect, to nurture, to be more than just a dispenser of medicines to strangers. These children needed more than healing. They needed a home, a guardian, someone who would choose them when the rest of the world had cast them aside. When dawn finally broke over the canyon rim, painting the adobe walls with shades of gold and rose, Tommy opened his eyes for the first time in days. His fever had broken completely, and though he was still weak from his ordeal, Nico could see that the crisis had passed. The boy would live, and with proper care, he would recover completely. Hope woke as her brother stirred, immediately leaning forward to take his hand. "Tommy, can you hear me? Hope?" The boy's voice was barely a whisper, but his eyes were clear and focused. "Where are we? I had such strange dreams." "We're safe," Hope said, tears of relief streaming down her face. "This man helped you get better. You were real sick, but you're going to be okay now." Tommy looked around the unfamiliar room with curious eyes, taking in the hanging herbs and shelves of mysterious bottles. When his gaze fell on Nico, who was standing quietly in the corner, the boy managed a weak smile. "Are you a doctor?" Tommy asked. "I am a healer," Nico replied, moving closer to the bed to check the boy's pulse and breathing. "And you are very lucky to be alive. Your sister saved your life by bringing you here." Hope looked up at Nico with eyes full of gratitude and something else, a desperate hope that she was afraid to voice. "What happens to us now?" she asked quietly. "We don't have nowhere to go, and we don't have no money to pay you for helping Tommy." Nico was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands resting gently on the boy's forehead as he checked for any return of fever. In that silence, he made a decision that would change all their lives forever. 7 years of solitude had not healed his own wounds, but perhaps caring for these wounded children might accomplish what isolation could not. "You will stay here," he said simply, his voice carrying a certainty that surprised even himself. "Both of you. There is room for a family in this canyon, and you are welcome to make it your home for as long as you need." Hope stared at him in stunned silence, hardly daring to believe what she had heard. "You mean it? You'd really let us stay?" "I mean it," Nico said, and for the first time in 7 years, he felt something like peace settling over his spirit. This place has been too quiet for too long. Perhaps it is time for it to remember what it sounds like when children laugh. As the morning sun climbed higher over the canyon walls, 3 wounded souls began the delicate process of becoming a family. None of them knew what challenges lay ahead, what enemies might threaten their fragile peace, or how their lives would be transformed by the choice to trust in love, despite the pain it might bring. They knew only that they had found each other in a vast and lonely land, and that sometimes the greatest healing comes not from herbs or medicines, but from the simple decision to care for someone who has nowhere else to turn. 3 weeks had passed since Hope and Tommy Carson had stumbled into Nico Earthwalker's canyon sanctuary, and the adobe dwelling had begun to transform in ways that surprised even its longtime inhabitant. Where once absolute silence had reigned between the stone walls, now the sound of children's voices drifted through the rooms like music Nico had forgotten existed. Tommy's laughter echoed off the canyon walls as he chased lizards in the morning sun, while Hope's gentle humming accompanied her daily tasks, filling the spaces that had been empty for far too long. The change went deeper than mere noise. Hope had an instinctive understanding of how a home should function, skills learned from years of caring for her ailing mother and younger brother. Without being asked, she had taken over the cooking, transforming Nico's simple meals of jerky and hardtack into proper suppers of beans and cornbread, wild greens gathered from the canyon floor, and rabbit stew seasoned with herbs from his own garden. She washed their clothes in the creek that ran behind the dwelling, mended tears with careful stitches, and swept the floors each morning until the adobe tiles gleamed. Tommy, though still recovering his full strength, had appointed himself Nico's apprentice in all matters relating to healing arts. The boy followed the Cahto healer everywhere, asking endless questions about plants and remedies, memorizing the names of herbs and their properties with the eagerness of youth. His small hands proved surprisingly gentle when helping to grind medicines, and his sharp eyes often spotted useful plants that even Nico's experienced gaze had missed. "What's this one for?" Tommy asked one morning, holding up a dried bundle of leaves that resembled mint but carried a sharper, more complex scent. "Yerba buena," Nico replied, watching the boy examine the herb with scientific curiosity. "It calms the stomach and eases headaches. My grandmother used to say it could also calm troubled spirits, though I have never been certain if that was medicine or merely wishful thinking." "Maybe both," Tommy said seriously, a comment that made Nico pause in his work and look at the child with new respect. For one so young, the boy showed remarkable wisdom about the connection between physical ailments and emotional wounds. The daily routine they had established felt natural, as if the 3 of them had always lived together in the canyon's embrace. Nico rose before dawn to tend his garden and gather plants while the children slept, returning as the sun painted the eastern rim with gold, to find Hope already preparing breakfast over the cooking fire. After eating, Tommy would join Nico in the workshop area of the adobe, learning to identify and prepare various remedies, while Hope managed the household tasks that kept their small family functioning smoothly. In the afternoons, when the desert heat made outdoor work impossible, Nico found himself telling stories of his people's traditions, sharing knowledge that he had thought would die with him. He spoke of the Cahto's ancient connection to the land, of ceremonies that honored the spirits of plants and animals, of healing practices that treated not just symptoms, but the whole person. The children listened with rapt attention, absorbing wisdom that few white settlers would ever hear. Your people must be very wise, Hope said one evening as they sat outside watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky. Everything you teach us makes so much sense, but I never heard nothing like it before. Nico was quiet for a moment, remembering his grandmother's voice as she had shared these same teachings with him decades ago. Wisdom comes from listening to the world around us, he said finally. Most people are too busy talking to hear what the earth is trying to tell them, but their peaceful routine was not without its challenges. Hope still woke crying from nightmares about her mother's death, and Tommy sometimes fell into silences. That reminded Nico painfully of his own grief after losing his family. There were practical concerns as well. Their clothes were wearing thin. Winter would eventually come to the desert, and Nico's modest supplies were being stretched to feed 3 people instead of 1. More troubling were the signs that their remote sanctuary might not remain hidden much longer. Twice in recent days, Nico had spotted dust clouds on the distant horizon that suggested riders, and the tracks around the creek showed that someone had been watering horses there during the night. In a territory where lawlessness was common, and strangers were often dangerous, such signs demanded careful attention. The mystery was solved on a Tuesday morning when Nico returned from his dawn plant gathering to find 3 men sitting their horses outside his dwelling. They were not Mexican vaqueros or Apache warriors, both of whom he would have recognized, but white men dressed in the dusty clothes of professional riders. Their leader, a lean man with a carefully waxed mustache and cold blue eyes, touched his hat brim in mock courtesy as Nico approached. "Morning," the man said, his voice carrying an accent that suggested education and authority. "You must be the medicine man we've been hearing about. Name's Marshal Robert Henley, and these are my deputies. We're looking for some missing children." Nico's blood ran cold, but he kept his expression neutral as he studied the 3 men. The marshal's badge looked authentic, and his companions carried themselves with the easy confidence of men accustomed to enforcing their will through violence. Behind them, Nico could see Hope's face peering anxiously through the window of the adobe, her green eyes wide with fear. "Many children go missing in the territory," Nico said carefully. "The desert and the Apache take their share, as do the outlaws who prey on travelers. What makes you think I would know anything about specific missing children?" Marshal Henley smiled, but the expression held no warmth. "Hope and Thomas Carson. Orphan children whose father was a known outlaw and whose mother died recently of disease. They disappeared from their homestead 3 weeks ago, and we have reason to believe they might have sought shelter with someone of your particular skills. And why would the territorial marshal concern himself with 2 orphan children?" Nico asked, genuinely puzzled. In his experience, law enforcement rarely went to such lengths to track down parentless children unless there was some compelling reason. Their father, James Carson, robbed the First Bank of Phoenix before his unfortunate demise, Henley explained, dismounting from his horse and taking a step closer to Nico. "The money was never recovered, and we believe he may have hidden it somewhere on the family property. Those children are the only ones who might know where to look." Nico understood immediately why the marshal was so determined to find Hope and Tommy. It wasn't concern for their welfare driving this search, but greed for the stolen money their father might have hidden. The lawmen saw the children not as human beings in need of protection, but as tools to recover a fortune that could make him wealthy beyond his current station. "I have seen no children matching that description," Nico said firmly. "I live alone in this canyon and have for many years. If such children had come here seeking help, I would certainly remember." The marshal's eyes narrowed as he studied Nico's face, clearly looking for signs of deception. "You won't mind if we search the premises then? Just to be thorough in our investigation." "I would mind very much," Nico replied, his voice taking on an edge that made the deputies shift uncomfortably in their saddles. "This is my home, and you have no authority to search it without evidence of wrongdoing. Unless you have such evidence, I suggest you continue your search elsewhere." For a tense moment, the two men stared at each other across the dusty ground. In front of the adobe dwelling, Nico could feel the weight of the marshal's suspicion, could sense the man's desire to push the confrontation further. But Henley was also a politician who understood the delicate balance of power in the territory, and antagonizing the local tribes by harassing one of their healers could have serious consequences. "We'll be back," the marshal said finally, swinging back up into his saddle. "And next time, we might have a warrant that gives us the authority to search wherever we please. I'd advise you to think carefully about whether you want to obstruct a federal investigation." The three men rode away in a cloud of dust, but Nico knew they wouldn't go far. Men like Henley didn't give up easily when money was involved, and the marshal had clearly decided that the children were somewhere in the area. It was only a matter of time before he returned with more men and legal authority to conduct a thorough search. Hope and Tommy emerged from the adobe as soon as the riders disappeared around a bend in the canyon. Both children looked terrified, and Tommy was clinging to his sister's hand with white knuckles. "They're looking for us," Hope said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They think we know where Papa hid that bank money, do you?" Nico asked. Gently, Hope shook her head emphatically. "Papa never told us nothing about no money. He left us in the spring, and we never saw him again until they brought his body back for burying. Mama said he died owing more than he ever stole." Nico believed her completely. James Carson had clearly been a man who destroyed everything he touched, including his own family. The idea that he had hidden a fortune somewhere for his children to find was almost certainly a fantasy, but it was a fantasy that could get Hope and Tommy killed if the wrong people became convinced of its truth. "We have to leave," Nico said, his mind already working through the logistics of a hasty departure. "The marshal will return soon with more men and legal papers that will force me to let them search. When they find you here, they will take you away, and I doubt they will be gentle in their questioning about your father's supposed treasure. Where can we go?" Tommy asked, his voice small and frightened. "We don't have nowhere else." Nico knelt down so that he was at eye level with both children, his weathered hands resting gently on their shoulders. "There is a place," he said quietly, "far to the north, in the mountains where my people once lived. It is a long journey and not without dangers, but if we can reach it, we will be safe from men like Marshal Henley." "Your people?" Hope asked. "You mean other Indians?" "Some," Nico replied, "but also others who have chosen to live apart from the towns and the territorial government. Miners who want to be left alone, homesteaders who ask no questions about their neighbors' pasts, even a few outlaws who prefer mountain hiding places to territorial justice. It is not an easy life, but it is a free one," the decision made. They spent the rest of the day preparing for immediate departure. Nico packed his most essential medicines and tools into leather saddlebags, while Hope gathered what food supplies they could carry, and Tommy helped collect seeds from the garden plants that might be needed to establish a new healing practice. Everything else, the furniture, the cooking pots, the carefully organized shelves of remedies, would have to be left behind. As evening approached, Nico performed one final ceremony in his canyon sanctuary. He burned sage and sweetgrass while offering prayers to the spirits who had protected him during his 7 years of solitude, asking for their continued guidance on the dangerous journey ahead. Hope and Tommy watched in respectful silence, sensing the significance of the moment, even if they didn't fully understand its spiritual meaning. "Will we ever come back?" Hope asked as Nico extinguished the ceremonial fire. "Perhaps," he said, though he doubted it privately. The canyon had served its purpose as a place of healing and refuge, but that chapter of his life was ending. Whatever came next would require different skills and different kinds of courage. They left before dawn the next morning, leading Nico's 2 horses up a narrow trail that climbed toward the canyon's northern rim. The marshal and his deputies were undoubtedly on their way back with reinforcements, but the head start would have to be enough. By the time Henley discovered the empty adobe dwelling, they would be miles away and climbing toward mountain.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
Passes that few white men knew how to navigate. As the sun rose behind them, painting the desert floor they were leaving in shades of gold and crimson, Hope looked back once at the canyon that had become their first real home. 3 weeks wasn't long in the span of a lifetime, but it had been long enough for roots to begin growing, for a family to begin forming in the space between loss and hope. "Don't worry," Nico said, noticing her backward glance. "Home isn't a place we leave behind. It's something we carry with us wherever we go." Tommy, riding double behind his sister on the smaller horse, nodded solemnly. "Like medicine," he said. "It's not the bottles and the plants that do the healing. It's the knowing how to use them." Nico smiled at the boy's wisdom, recognizing in that moment that his teaching had already taken root in ways he hadn't expected. Whatever challenges lay ahead in the mountains, whatever new enemies might emerge to threaten their fragile family, they would face them together. And sometimes, that was the strongest medicine of all. The trail ahead wound through increasingly rugged terrain, leading toward peaks that gleamed white with snow even in a desert heat. Behind them, dust clouds on the horizon suggested that Marshal Henley had indeed returned to continue his search, but the distance was growing with each mile they climbed. For now, they were free, and for a family that had known too much captivity to circumstances beyond their control, freedom was worth any hardship the mountain trail might demand. The Mogollon Mountains rose before them like ancient sentinels carved from stone and shadow, their peaks disappearing into clouds that promised either shelter or storm. 5 days had passed since their hasty departure from the canyon sanctuary, and the desert's brutal heat had given way to the thin, sharp air of high altitude. Hope Carson pulled her worn shawl tighter around her shoulders as their horses picked their way along a narrow ledge that seemed to have been carved from the mountainside by some long-dead giant's hand. Nico Earthwalker rode ahead on the larger horse, his keen eyes constantly scanning the trail for signs of danger or pursuit. Behind him, Hope and Tommy shared the smaller Mar, both children maintaining the stoic silence that had become their defense against fear and uncertainty. The higher they climbed, the more treacherous the path became, and one misstep could send them tumbling into ravines so deep that their bones would never be found. The territory they were entering was unlike anything the children had ever seen, where the desert below had been harsh but predictable in its hostility. These mountains harbored mysteries that went beyond mere physical danger. Ancient Apache hunting trails crossed paths that predated human memory, and the very air seemed to whisper with voices of those who had walked these heights before them. Nico knew these mountains held both salvation and peril in equal measure, and the difference between the two often came down to respect for powers greater than oneself. "How much further?" Tommy asked, his voice barely carrying over the wind that howled through the stone corridors surrounding them. The boy had shown remarkable courage during their flight from the canyon, but even his young spirit was beginning to feel the weight of constant vigilance and uncertain destination. "We are close now," Nico replied, though he knew that close in mountain terms could still mean days of difficult travel. "There is a settlement ahead called Copper Creek, built around an old mining claim. The people there ask few questions and offer aid to those who prove themselves worthy of trust." What Nico didn't tell the children was that reaching Copper Creek alive would require surviving one of the most dangerous stretches of trail in the entire territory. The path ahead wound through a narrow canyon known to the Apache as the place of screaming winds, where sudden storms could trap travelers for days and rock slides could obliterate the trail without warning. It was also the perfect place for an ambush, which meant they would need to move quickly and quietly if they hoped to pass through undetected. The first sign of trouble came not from behind them, but from ahead. As they rounded a bend in the trail, Nico suddenly raised his hand for silence and dismounted from his horse with fluid grace. His dark eyes were fixed on something Hope couldn't see, but the tension in his posture told her that danger was near. She felt Tommy's small hands tighten around her waist as they waited for Nico's assessment of whatever threat had captured his attention. "Horses," Nico said quietly, pointing toward a section of the trail about a quarter-mile ahead where the path widened into a small clearing. "At least 4 riders, and they have been waiting there for some time. The way they have positioned themselves suggests they know someone is coming." Hope's heart sank as she realized what this meant. Marshal Henley had somehow managed to get ahead of them, probably by taking a more direct route through Apache territory that only someone with official backing would dare attempt. The lawman had anticipated their destination and set a trap in the one place where retreat would be impossible. "Can we go around them?" Hope asked, though she already suspected the answer from the grim expression on Nico's weathered face. "The trail here follows the only safe passage through these peaks," Nico replied. "To go around would mean climbing faces of rock that would challenge experienced mountaineers, and we do not have the equipment for such an attempt. We must either find another way through, or we must turn back." Turning back meant descending into the desert where Henley's other deputies were undoubtedly waiting, while going forward meant confronting armed men in a position of their choosing. Neither option offered much hope for survival, especially with 2 children whose safety had to be Nico's primary concern. But as he studied the terrain ahead, an idea began to form in his mind, one that would require considerable risk, but might offer their only chance of reaching safety. "There is another possibility," he said slowly, his eyes fixed on the steep slopes that rose above the trail. "These mountains are filled with old mining tunnels and caves. If we could find a way to reach the higher ground, we might be able to bypass the ambush entirely." The plan that emerged was desperate, but not impossible. About 100 yards behind their current position, Nico had noticed what appeared to be the entrance to an abandoned mine shaft carved into the mountainside. If the tunnel connected to the network of caves that honeycombed these peaks, they might be able to travel underground and emerge beyond the waiting ambush. It would mean abandoning their horses and trusting their lives to passages that could collapse at any moment, but it was better than riding directly into Henley's guns. They backtracked carefully, leading their horses to a small grove of stunted pines where the animals could be left with enough grass and water to survive until someone found them. Hope watched sadly as Nico removed the saddles and bridles, knowing that these faithful beasts had carried them to safety but could go no further. On the journey ahead, in a territory where a good horse often meant the difference between life and death, leaving them behind felt like severing their last connection to the world they had known. The mine entrance was partially collapsed with heavy timber supports that groaned ominously in the mountain wind. Nico tested each beam carefully before trusting their weight to it, knowing that a cave-in would entomb them as effectively as Marshal Henley's bullets. The air inside the tunnel was cold and stale, carrying the scent of old dynamite and something else, the metallic smell of copper ore that had drawn miners to these heights decades before. "Stay close and watch where you step," Nico instructed, as they entered the darkness with only a single oil lamp to guide their way. "These old workings can be treacherous, and we cannot afford to become separated underground." The tunnel stretched ahead into blackness that seemed to swallow their lamp's feeble light. Their footsteps echoed strangely in the confined space, creating phantom sounds that made them all jump at shadows. Hope found herself thinking about her mother's stories of the dead, who were said to wander in places where the earth had been wounded by man's greed for metal and stone. She tried to push such thoughts away, but the oppressive atmosphere of the abandoned mine made it difficult to focus on anything but the very real possibility that they might never see daylight again. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes, they reached a junction where their tunnel met another passage that sloped upward toward what Nico hoped would be an exit on the far side of the mountain. The air here moved slightly, suggesting an opening to the surface somewhere ahead. But the path was even more treacherous than the main tunnel. Loose rocks littered the floor, and the ceiling was so low in places that even the children had to crawl on hands and knees. It was Tommy who made the discovery that saved them all. As they paused to rest in a small chamber where several passages converged, the boy noticed a faint current of fresh air coming from what appeared to be a solid wall of rock. Investigation revealed a narrow crack that had been concealed by shadows, just wide enough for a person to squeeze through if they didn't mind scraping against rough stone. "Where does it lead?" Hope asked, peering into the opening that seemed to disappear into the mountain's heart. Nico extinguished their lamp and waited for his eyes to adjust to the darkness. After several minutes, he could make out a faint glow coming from somewhere beyond the cracked natural light that meant an opening to the outside world. It was their best chance, perhaps their only chance, of emerging from the underground maze that had become their refuge and their prison. The passage beyond the crack was barely wide enough for an adult to navigate, forcing them to move in single file with their few possessions strapped tightly to their backs. The rock walls pressed in from both sides, and more than once Hope felt panic rising in her chest as she imagined being trapped forever in this stone coffin. Only the sound of Tommy's steady breathing behind her and Nico's quiet encouragement ahead kept her moving forward through the claustrophobic nightmare. When they finally emerged into daylight, it took several minutes for their eyes to adjust to the brilliance of mountain sunshine. They found themselves on a narrow ledge high above the trail where Marshal Henley's ambush waited, with a clear view of the men and horses positioned below. From this vantage point, they could see that the Marshal had indeed brought reinforcements. At least 6 men now waited in the clearing, all armed and ready for violence. "They will wait there for days if necessary," Nico observed, studying the deployment of men and weapons below. "Henley is committed to this course of action, and he has the resources to maintain a siege indefinitely." But their escape from the underground passages had brought them to a place of unexpected opportunity. The ledge they stood on connected to a series of natural walkways that followed the mountain's contours, eventually leading to a descent that would bring them out miles beyond the ambush site. It would still be dangerous travel, especially for children not accustomed to mountain climbing, but it offered genuine hope of reaching safety as they began their careful traverse of the mountain face. Hope found herself thinking about the choices that had brought them to this moment. 3 weeks ago, she had been a desperate girl carrying her dying brother across the desert, with no hope beyond finding someone who might ease his suffering. Now she was part of a family that faced its dangers together, with a guardian who valued their lives above his own safety and comfort. The afternoon sun was beginning to slant toward the western peaks when they finally reached a point where descent became possible. The trail here was ancient, probably carved by Apache hunters generations before any white man had seen these mountains, and it switched back down the mountainside in a series of narrow shelves that required careful navigation. One advantage of such an old path was that it was designed by people who understood how to move through dangerous terrain without leaving obvious signs of passage. By evening, they had descended far enough to reach a small valley where a creek provided fresh water and a grove of aspen trees offered concealment for the night. Nico judged they had traveled far enough from Henley's position to risk a small fire, and soon they were eating a meal of dried meat and wild onions while their clothes dried from the day's exertions. For the first time since leaving the canyon sanctuary, they could rest without constantly listening for the sound of pursuing hoofbeats. "Tomorrow we should reach Copper Creek," Nico said as they prepared to sleep under a canopy of stars brighter than any Hope had ever seen in the desert. "The people there will help us establish a new life, but it will be different from what we have known before." "Different how?" Tommy asked, his young face serious in the flickering firelight. "Mountain people live by different rules than those in the flatlands," Nico explained. "They value self-reliance above law, loyalty above wealth, and they judge a person by their actions rather than their ancestry. It will be a good place for us to grow strong, but we must be prepared to prove ourselves worthy of their acceptance. Hope listened to this explanation while watching the play of firelight across Nico's weathered features. In the weeks since he had taken them in, she had seen him change from a solitary healer focused only on his plants and remedies, into something approaching a father protective, wise, and willing to sacrifice everything for their welfare. She wondered if he realized how much he had given up for 2 orphan children he barely knew, and whether he ever regretted the choice that had cost him his peaceful sanctuary. As if reading her thoughts, Nico turned to meet her gaze across the dying fire. "You are wondering if I wish things had been different," he said quietly. "If I regret leaving my canyon for this uncertain journey." Hope nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady if she tried to speak. "For 7 years, I lived alone with my grief and my memories," Nico continued. "I told myself that solitude was healing, that isolation would eventually ease the pain of loss. But grief that is not shared becomes a poison that slowly kills the spirit. You and Tommy have given me something I thought was lost forever. Reason to look toward tomorrow instead of dwelling in yesterday." Tommy had fallen asleep against his sister's shoulder, exhausted by the day's challenges but secure in the knowledge that he was protected and loved. Looking at his peaceful face, Hope felt a surge of gratitude so powerful it brought tears to her eyes. They had lost everything: parents, home, security, but somehow they had found something precious in return. A family chosen rather than born, bound together by shared hardship and mutual devotion. The wind through the aspen trees sang a lullaby older than human memory as the 3 survivors of loss and betrayal settled down to sleep. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers, perhaps new enemies who sought to tear apart what they had built together. But tonight they were safe, they were together, and they were stronger than any of them had been alone. In a world that showed little mercy to the vulnerable, they had found in each other the courage to keep believing in hope. And sometimes that was the most powerful medicine of all. Copper Creek clung to the mountainside, like a collection of wooden boxes scattered by a careless giant, its weathered buildings connected by narrow boardwalks that defied both gravity and common sense. Smoke rose from a dozen chimneys despite the warm afternoon air, and the sound of hammers on metal rang through the thin mountain atmosphere as the settlement's inhabitants went about their daily work. To Hope Carson's eyes, accustomed to the adobe structures and desert spaces of lower elevations, the town looked like something from a fever dream: all angles and precarious perches that seemed ready to tumble into the valley below at the first strong wind. Nico Earthwalker led them down the final switchback of the mountain trail with the confident stride of a man who knew he was approaching sanctuary. 3 days had passed since their escape through the mine tunnels, and their journey through the high country had been mercifully free of pursuit. Marshal Henley's forces were presumably still waiting at their abandoned ambush site, growing increasingly frustrated as they realized their quarry had somehow vanished into the mountains like morning mist. The first person to greet them was a woman of indeterminate age whose steel-gray hair was braided with strips of colored leather, and whose hands bore the permanent stains of someone who worked with dyes and chemicals. She emerged from a building that might have been a general store, though its windows displayed an eclectic collection of items ranging from mining tools to Native American pottery. Her sharp blue eyes took in the travel-worn appearance of the newcomers with the practiced assessment of someone accustomed to evaluating strangers. "Nico Earthwalker," she said, her voice carrying the faint trace of an accent that might have been Irish or Scottish. "It's been 3 years since you last graced our mountain with your presence. I trust you bring more than just your healing skills this time." "I bring family, Bridget O'Malley," Nico replied, gesturing toward Hope and Tommy with unmistakable pride. "Hope and Tommy Carson, who have traveled far to reach this place of safety. They have proven themselves worthy of the mountain's protection." Bridget's weathered face softened as she studied the 2 children, taking note of their obvious exhaustion and the way they instinctively moved closer to Nico when faced with yet another stranger. "Children of the trail," she murmured, using a phrase that seemed to carry special meaning in this remote community. "You're welcome in Copper Creek, young ones. Though I suspect your arrival brings complications along with blessings." Hope found herself warming to this sharp-eyed woman, whose directness reminded her of her own mother's practical nature. "Thank you, Mom," she said politely. "We're grateful for any kindness, and we're willing to work for our keep." "Work there will be," Bridget assured her with a smile that transformed her stern features. "But first, you'll need rest, food, and proper mountain clothes. The nights here can freeze a person solid, even in summer, and your desert garments won't provide adequate protection." As they followed Bridget through the settlement's winding pathways, Hope began to understand why Nico had spoken of Copper Creek with such respect. This was not merely a mining town, but a carefully constructed refuge for people who had chosen to live outside the reach of territorial law and federal authority. The inhabitants they passed included weathered prospectors, Mexican families who had fled violence south of the border, former slaves seeking true freedom in the high country, and even a few individuals whose expensive clothes and educated speech suggested they were hiding from more than just poverty. The building Bridget led them to was larger than most, built into the mountainside with runes carved directly from the living rock. The main floor served as both her residence and business establishment, while the upper levels provided lodging for travelers and new arrivals who had not yet established their own homes. The interior was surprisingly comfortable, with hand-woven rugs covering the wooden floors and oil lamps providing warm light that reflected off polished copper fixtures. "You'll have the back rooms on the second level," Bridget announced, leading them up a narrow staircase that had been carved from a single massive tree trunk. 2 chambers with a shared sitting area, and access to the kitchen for your own cooking. The rate is $2 per week, or equivalent work if you prefer to earn your lodging. Hope quickly calculated their meager resources and realized they could afford perhaps 1 week of paid lodging before their small savings were exhausted. "What kind of work would be available?" she asked, hoping her voice didn't betray their desperate financial situation. "For you, child, there are several possibilities," Bridget replied, her keen eyes having already assessed Hope's capabilities. "I need assistance with my dyeing and weaving operations, which require steady hands and careful attention to detail. There's also the settlement school, such as it is, which could use someone who can read and write to help teach the younger children. And for me?" Tommy piped up, his young voice filled with eagerness to contribute to their family's welfare. Bridget smiled at his earnestness. "A boy your age might find employment with Jacob Steiner, who runs our blacksmith operation. He's been looking for an apprentice who can handle the lighter work while learning a valuable trade. The pay is modest, but the skills you would acquire are worth more than gold in a place like this." That evening, as they settled into their new quarters, Hope felt a mixture of relief and apprehension about their situation. The rooms were clean and comfortable, with real beds instead of bedrolls on the ground, and the view from their window showed the vast expanse of mountains stretching away toward distant horizons. But she also understood that their safety depended on their ability to become productive members of this isolated community, and the margin for error in such a harsh environment was virtually non-existent. Nico had disappeared shortly after their arrival, mentioning something about visiting old friends and re-establishing professional connections that had been dormant during his years of solitude. Hope suspected there was more to his activities than simple social calls, but she had learned to trust his judgment in matters that affected their security. Whatever arrangements he was making, she was confident they were in the family's best interests. The next morning brought their first real introduction to life in Copper Creek's unique society. Hope accompanied Bridget to the workshop, where the older woman produced the dyes and textiles that provided much of the settlement's trade goods, while Tommy reported to Jacob Steiner's smithy to begin learning the mysteries of metalworking. Both children approached their new responsibilities with determination, born of necessity and gratitude for the opportunity to prove themselves useful. Bridget's workshop was a marvel of organized chaos, with vats of boiling dye solutions filling the air with pungent chemical scents, while completed textiles hung from every available surface in brilliant shades of red, blue, and gold. The work required precise timing and careful attention to temperature and chemical ratios, skills that Hope found herself mastering with surprising speed. Her years of caring for her mother and managing household responsibilities had taught her to follow complex instructions and maintain focus during long, repetitive tasks. "You have the hands for this work," Bridget observed as Hope successfully completed her first solo dyeing operation, producing a length of wool cloth in a deep blue that rivaled the mountain sky. "More importantly, you have the patience and the eye for detail that separate adequate craftsworkers from true artisans." Tommy's experience at the blacksmith shop proved equally successful, though in different ways. Jacob Steiner was a German immigrant whose broken English and patient teaching methods made him an ideal mentor for a young boy eager to learn. The physical demands of the work were helping Tommy regain the strength he had lost during his illness, while the creative aspects of shaping metal into useful objects appealed to his naturally curious mind. "The boy has potential," Jacob reported to Nico when the healer stopped by the smithy to check on Tommy's progress. "His hands are still small, but they are already learning to feel the metal's temperature and resistance. Give him a few months, and he will be able to handle most of the routine work without supervision." As the days passed, Hope began to understand that Copper Creek operated according to principles that were both simpler and more complex than the laws governing settlements in the flatlands. There was no official sheriff or mayor, but disputes were resolved by a council of respected elders who commanded authority through demonstrated wisdom rather than appointed power. Justice was swift and practical, focused more on restitution and community harmony than punishment for its own sake. The settlement's economy was based on mutual interdependence rather than pure capitalism, with essential services provided on a sliding scale that ensured everyone's basic needs were met regardless of their ability to pay. Those who could afford to pay full rates for goods and services subsidized those who could only contribute labor or other forms of value. It was a system that required a high level of trust and social cohesion, but it had apparently worked for the decade plus that Copper Creek had existed. Hope's education in mountain society took an unexpected turn when she discovered the settlement's most closely guarded secret. It happened by accident when she was returning late from the dye workshop and took a wrong turn in the maze of corridors that connected Bridget's building to the rest of the settlement. Instead of emerging onto the main boardwalk, she found herself in a basement area she had never seen before. The space was clearly being used as a printing operation, with an actual printing press occupying the center of the room and stacks of freshly printed materials covering every available surface. But these were not the usual territorial newspapers or commercial handbills that might be expected in a frontier town. Instead, Hope found herself looking at carefully crafted documents that appeared to be official territorial papers, marriage certificates, property deeds, even what looked like territorial marshal badges. "You've wandered into the wrong corridor, child," said a voice behind her, causing Hope to spin around in startled surprise. The speaker was a man she had seen around the settlement, but never been introduced to middle-aged, well-dressed, with the soft hands of someone who worked with paper rather than tools. His expression was more concerned than threatening, but Hope could sense the seriousness of her accidental discovery. "I'm sorry," Hope said quickly. "I got turned around coming back from Mrs. O'Malley's workshop. I was just trying to find my way back to our rooms." The man studied her face carefully, apparently trying to assess whether her presence was truly accidental or represented some kind of threat to the operation she had stumbled upon.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
"My name is Marcus Whitfield," he said finally. And what you've seen here is something that helps keep this community safe from people who would do us harm." Hope's quick mind immediately grasped the implications of what she was seeing. Copper Creek's ability to harbor fugitives and refugees depended partly on its ability to provide them with new identities when necessary. The printing operation was producing the documents that allowed people to disappear from their old lives and emerge with clean papers that would satisfy casual scrutiny from territorial authorities. "I understand," Hope said quietly, "and I won't tell anyone what I've seen here. My family owes this place too much to betray its secrets." Marcus seemed to relax slightly at her words, recognizing the sincerity in her voice. "Your family," he repeated thoughtfully. "Yes, Nico Earthwalker has spoken of you and your brother to several of us. He believes you have the potential to become valuable members of our community, not just temporary refugees seeking shelter." That night, as Hope lay in her narrow bed, listening to Tommy's peaceful breathing from the adjacent room, she reflected on the complex reality of their new home. Copper Creek offered genuine safety and the opportunity to build a new life free from the mistakes and tragedies of the past. But it also required its inhabitants to participate in activities that existed in the gray areas between legal and illegal, moral and immoral. The forged documents that might save an escaped slave's life could also help a genuine criminal evade justice for serious crimes. The moral complexity of their situation was driven home the following morning when Nico gathered Hope and Tommy for a serious conversation about their future in the settlement. They met in the small sitting area of their lodgings, with morning sunlight streaming through the window to illuminate the weathered features of the man who had become their protector and guide. "There are things you need to understand about this place," Nico began, his voice carrying the gravity of someone imparting crucial information. "Copper Creek exists because it serves needs that the territorial government cannot or will not address. We provide sanctuary for people who have been failed by official justice, healing for those who cannot afford doctors, and new beginnings for those whose old lives have become impossible to continue. But that means some of the people here might be criminals," Tommy said, his young mind grappling with the implications of their situation. "Some are," Nico acknowledged. "But so are some of the people who wear badges and sit in judges' chairs in the territorial capital. The difference is that here, people are judged by their actions after they arrive, not by whatever brought them to seek refuge in the first place." Hope listened to this explanation while thinking about her own family's situation. Their father had been an outlaw who abandoned his family and died in the commission of a crime, making them targets for men like Marshall Henley who saw them as tools to recover stolen money. In the eyes of territorial law, they were probably considered accomplices to their father's crimes, despite having no knowledge of his activities or whereabouts. Copper Creek offered them a chance to escape that inherited guilt and build lives based on their own choices rather than their father's mistakes. "What's expected of us?" Hope asked, voicing the question that had been weighing on her mind since their arrival. "Loyalty to the community," Nico replied immediately. "Willingness to contribute according to your abilities, and discretion about the things you may see or hear that others might not understand, and in return, protection, education, the opportunity to become the people you choose to be rather than the people circumstances tried to force you to become." As they talked, Hope began to understand that Nico's own relationship with Copper Creek went much deeper than she had initially realized. He was not merely a healer who occasionally visited the settlement, but one of its founding members and most trusted advisors. His years of solitude in the canyon had been a form of self-imposed exile from responsibilities he had found too painful to bear after losing his original family. "You helped create this place," Hope said, the realization dawning as she studied his face. "I helped plant the seeds," Nico corrected. "But communities like this grow themselves, shaped by the needs and dreams of everyone who chooses to make them home. My contribution was knowledge of healing and understanding of how different peoples can live together despite their differences." The conversation was interrupted by a commotion outside their window, shouting voices and the sound of running feet on the wooden boardwalks that connected Copper Creek's buildings. Nico moved quickly to look outside, his expression growing grim as he observed whatever was happening in the settlement's main area. "What is it?" Hope asked, joining him at the window. "Riders approaching," Nico said tersely. "Armed men in territorial uniforms, and they're flying a federal marshal's flag." Hope felt her blood turn to ice as she realized what this meant. Somehow, Marshal Henley had tracked them to Copper Creek, and their mountain sanctuary was about to face its greatest test. The safety they had found was about to be challenged by the very forces they had fled into the wilderness to escape, and the outcome would determine not just their own fate, but the future of everyone who had chosen to make this remote settlement their home. Marshal Robert Henley rode into Copper Creek at the head of a column that included not just his original deputies, but a full squad of territorial rangers and 2 men whose black suits and federal badges marked them as government agents from back east. The sound of their horses' hooves on the wooden boardwalks echoed through the mountain settlement like thunder before a storm, and Hope Carson felt her heart sink as she counted the overwhelming force that had somehow tracked them to their mountain sanctuary. From their window overlooking the settlement's main thoroughfare, Hope watched the federal force deploy with military precision. These were not the casual lawmen who might be satisfied with cursory searches and vague denials, but professionals who had come prepared for serious resistance. The lead agent, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles and the pale complexion of someone who spent most of his time in Washington offices, dismounted and began issuing orders that sent his subordinates to block every trail leading out of Copper Creek. "They've planned this carefully," Nico observed, his weathered face grim, as he studied the deployment of men and weapons below. "Someone provided them with detailed information about our settlement's layout and defenses. This is not a chance discovery or lucky guess." The implications of his words sent a chill through Hope's chest. If the federal agents had inside information about Copper Creek's operations, it meant their secret document forging business was compromised, along with the identities of everyone who had sought refuge in the mountain community. The carefully constructed sanctuary that had protected dozens of fugitives and refugees was about to be torn apart by forces that recognized no law but their own authority. Tommy joined them at the window, his young face pale but determined, as he watched the federal agents establish their perimeter around the settlement. "Are they here just for us?" he asked quietly. "I suspect we are merely the excuse they needed," Nico replied. "The territorial government has been looking for a reason to shut down Copper Creek for years, but they needed federal backing to justify the cost and manpower required for an operation in this remote location." Below in the settlement's main square, Bridget O'Malley was conducting what appeared to be a heated negotiation with Marshal Henley and the federal agent in charge. Even from their elevated position, Hope could see the tension in Bridget's posture as she faced down the government representatives who had invaded her community. The older woman was clearly buying time, allowing the settlement's residents to prepare for whatever confrontation was about to unfold. "We need to get you children out of here," Nico said suddenly, turning away from the window with the decisive movement of a man who had reached a difficult conclusion. "There are trails leading deeper into the mountains that these federal agents don't know about. If you leave now, while they're focused on establishing their positions, you might be able to reach the old Apache strongholds, where even territorial rangers fear to follow." Hope stared at him in shock, hardly able to believe what she was hearing. "You want us to leave without you?" "I want you to survive," Nico replied firmly. "These men have come here because they believe you possess knowledge about your father's stolen money. If you're not here when they conduct their search, they will have no reason to tear this community apart looking for information that doesn't exist." "But what about you?" Tommy asked, his voice breaking with emotion. "What happens to our family if we run away and leave you behind?" Nico knelt down so that he was at eye level with both children, his dark eyes reflecting the pain of a man forced to make an impossible choice. Family means protecting each other, even when that protection requires sacrifice. If I come with you, we will all be caught within hours because I am too old to maintain the pace necessary to outrun mounted pursuers. If I stay and face whatever charges they bring against me, you will have a chance to escape and build new lives elsewhere. The conversation was interrupted by heavy footsteps on the wooden stairs leading to their lodgings, followed by the unmistakable sound of armed men positioning themselves outside their door. Marshal Henley's voice carried clearly through the thin wooden walls as he addressed whoever was accompanying him up the staircase. This is where the innkeeper said, "They're staying. Remember, we need the children alive and cooperative. But the Indian is expendable if he causes trouble." Hope felt terror and rage warring in her chest as she realized the casual way these men were discussing Nico's life. To them, he was not a skilled healer who had saved countless lives or a guardian who had risked everything to protect 2 orphan children. He was simply an obstacle to be removed if convenient, a life with no more value than the animals they rode or the equipment they carried. The knock on their door was perfunctory, followed immediately by the sound of the latch being lifted. From outside, Marshal Henley entered first, his hand resting on his pistol butt, followed by 2 deputies and the pale federal agent who had been directing the operation. The cramped sitting area suddenly felt impossibly small with 6 people, crowded into a space designed for family conversations. Hope and Thomas Carson, Marshal Henley announced formally, though his eyes never left Nico's face. "You are under federal arrest for conspiracy to conceal stolen property and obstruction of justice. Agent Morrison here has some questions about your father's activities before his unfortunate demise." Agent Morrison stepped forward, removing a leather portfolio from his coat and consulting the papers inside with bureaucratic precision. "Miss Carson," he said, his voice carrying the flat tones of someone reading from an official script. "Federal investigators have determined that your father, James Carson, successfully robbed the First Bank of Phoenix of $47,000 in gold certificates and currency. The money was never recovered, and witnesses report seeing him in the company of 2 children, matching your descriptions, shortly before his death. We never saw our father after he left home in the spring," Hope said firmly, though her voice shook with the strain of maintaining composure under such pressure. "We don't know nothing about any stolen money, and we certainly don't know where he might have hidden it, perhaps." Agent Morrison replied with the thin smile of someone who had heard similar denials countless times before. "But you will accompany us back to Phoenix where more thorough questioning can be conducted. There are techniques for refreshing memory that have proven quite effective in cases involving missing federal property." The casual threat in his words was unmistakable, and Hope understood that these men were prepared to use whatever methods they deemed necessary to extract information that simply didn't exist. They would torture 2 children based on the slim possibility that a father who had abandoned them might have shared criminal secrets before disappearing forever. "The children are under my protection," Nico said quietly, his voice carrying an edge that made several of the lawmen shift uncomfortably. "They have committed no crimes and possess no knowledge of criminal activities. Your quarrel is with a dead man who can no longer answer for his actions." Marshal Henley's hand tightened on his pistol grip as he studied Nico's defiant posture. "Your protection doesn't extend beyond this room, medicine man. Step aside, or be arrested as an accessory to federal crimes." What happened next unfolded with the swift violence that characterized frontier justice when civilized negotiation failed. Nico moved with surprising speed for a man of his age, drawing a knife from his belt and placing himself between the federal agents and the children they had come to seize. His message was clear. They would have to go through him to reach Hope and Tommy, and he was prepared to make that passage as costly as possible. "Last warning," Marshal Henley snarled, drawing his pistol and pointing it directly at Nico's chest. "Drop the knife and step away from those children. I have spent 7 years learning to live with the ghosts of family I failed to protect. Nico replied, his voice steady despite the weapon aimed at his heart. I will not add 2 more spirits to that burden. The standoff might have ended in bloodshed if not for the sudden eruption of gunfire from somewhere else in the settlement. The sharp crack of rifles and the deeper boom of shotguns echoed through Copper Creek's narrow canyons, followed by shouting voices and the screams of wounded men. Agent Morrison's carefully planned operation was encountering resistance from quarters he had not anticipated. What the hell is happening out there? Marshal Henley demanded, his attention momentarily diverted from the confrontation in the cramped lodging room. Through the window, Hope could see muzzle flashes from several buildings as Copper Creek's residents fought back against the federal invasion. These were not helpless refugees cowering before government authority, but hardened frontier survivors who had chosen to make their stand in this remote mountain stronghold. Many of them were former soldiers, experienced hunters, and others who possessed both the skills and the determination necessary for serious combat. The distraction created by the settlement's armed resistance gave Nico the opening he needed. With fluid grace that belied his years, he extinguished the oil lamp that provided the room's only illumination and threw himself sideways, carrying both children to the floor behind the heavy wooden table that served as their dining surface. In the sudden darkness, the federal agents found themselves shooting blind while their targets took cover behind furniture that had been built to withstand mountain weather. Move toward the back wall, Nico whispered urgently to Hope and Tommy, as bullets splintered the wooden walls around them. There's a window that leads to the roof, and from there we can reach the escape routes that lead deeper into the mountains. The fighting outside was intensifying as more of Copper Creek's residents joined the battle against the federal forces. Hope could hear Bridget O'Malley's voice shouting orders from somewhere near the settlement's main defensive positions, coordinating resistance with the authority of someone who had prepared for this possibility. The mountain community was revealing its true nature, not a collection of helpless refugees, but a fortress defended by people who had nowhere else to retreat. Agent Morrison's voice cut through the chaos as he attempted to regain control of his deteriorating operation. Secure those children at all costs. They're the key to recovering federal property worth more than this entire settlement. But Nico had already guided Hope and Tommy through the narrow window that led onto the sloping roof of Bridget's establishment. The wooden shingles were slippery with mountain dew and treacherous to navigate in darkness, but they offered a route to freedom that the federal agents couldn't easily follow. From their elevated position, they could see the full scope of the battle raging through Copper Creek's winding streets. The settlement's defenders had taken positions in buildings that commanded clear fields of fire along the main approaches, forcing the federal forces to advance through killing zones, where every doorway and window might conceal a rifle barrel. Marshal Henley's carefully planned operation was disintegrating into a costly urban battle against opponents who knew every inch of their mountain fortress. This way, Nico said quietly, leading them along the roofline toward a point where they could descend to one of the wooden walkways that connected Copper Creek's scattered buildings. There's a trail that leads to the old mining claims above the settlement. If we can reach it without being seen, we can disappear into country that even Apache warriors find challenging to navigate. Their escape across the settlement's rooftops required careful timing to avoid being silhouetted against the star-filled sky when muzzle flashes illuminated their surroundings. Hope found herself thinking about the irony of their situation. They were fleeing from lawmen who claimed to represent justice, while being protected by a community of outlaws and refugees who had shown them more genuine compassion than any official authority. The descent from the roofs to the walkways proved to be the most dangerous part of their escape, requiring them to drop nearly 10 feet onto wooden planking that groaned ominously under their weight. Tommy landed awkwardly, twisting his ankle but managing to suppress the cry of pain that might have revealed their position to the federal agents, who were systematically searching every building in the settlement. "Can you walk?" Nico asked quietly, examining the boy's injured foot with experienced hands. "I can walk," Tommy replied through gritted teeth. Though Hope could see tears of pain streaming down his face in the dim starlight, they reached the trailhead just as a new wave of gunfire erupted from the settlement's central area, suggesting that the federal forces were making another attempt to break through Copper Creek's defensive perimeter. The sound of battle was both heartbreaking and inspiring. Heartbreaking, because it meant their mountain sanctuary was being destroyed. Inspiring because it proved that some communities would fight rather than surrender to unjust authority. The trail that led away from Copper Creek was barely visible in the darkness, more of a suggestion carved into the mountainside by decades of careful foot traffic than an actual road suitable for horses or vehicles. It wound upward through terrain so rugged that pursuit would be virtually impossible for anyone unfamiliar with its treacherous footing and hidden obstacles. For the first time since Marshal Henley had appeared in the settlement, Hope began to believe they might actually escape. As they climbed higher into the mountains, the sound of gunfire gradually faded behind them until it was barely audible above the wind that howled through the high country stone corridors. But even as physical distance separated them from the battle, Hope found herself thinking about the people they were leaving behind. Bridget O'Malley, who had welcomed them with such kindness. Jacob Steiner, who had been teaching Tommy the mysteries of metalworking. Marcus Whitfield, whose document forgery operation had helped so many people escape impossible situations. Will they be all right? She asked Nico as they paused to rest beside a small stream that cascaded down the mountainside in a series of natural pools. "Some will survive," Nico replied honestly. "Bridget and the other leaders have escape plans for situations like this. And they know hiding places in these mountains that no government agent will ever find. But others will be captured or killed, and Copper Creek, as we knew it, is probably finished forever." The weight of responsibility for the destruction of their mountain sanctuary pressed down on Hope's shoulders like a physical burden. If she and Tommy had never sought refuge in Copper Creek, Agent Morrison would have had no excuse to organize his federal raid. Dozens of innocent people were suffering because 2 orphan children had brought danger into their peaceful community. "This is not your fault," Nico said firmly, recognizing the guilt that was eating away at her spirit. Men like Agent Morrison would have found some excuse to attack Copper Creek eventually. Communities that operate outside official control are always seen as threats by those who profit from maintaining the status quo. Tommy limped alongside them with the stubborn determination of youth, refusing to complain about his injured ankle despite the obvious pain each step caused him. The boy's courage reminded Hope of their mother's strength during her final illness, the way she had endured suffering without self-pity while focusing on the welfare of her children. It was a legacy worth honoring, regardless of what hardships lay ahead on the mountain trails that stretched before them. As dawn approached, painting the eastern peaks with shades of gold and rose, they reached a vantage point that offered a clear view back toward Copper Creek's location in the valley below. Smoke was rising from several buildings in the settlement, and the absence of continued gunfire suggested that the battle had reached some kind of conclusion. Whether that meant victory for the defenders or successful occupation by federal forces remained unclear from their distant observation post. "Where do we go now?" Hope asked, voicing the question that had been haunting all 3 of them since their escape began. Nico was quiet for a long moment, his weathered face reflecting the weight of decisions that would determine their survival in a hostile wilderness. "North," he said finally. "Toward the territories where federal authority means less and ancient laws still hold power. It will be a hard journey, but at the end of it lies the possibility of true freedom." As they resumed their climb toward the high country that promised either salvation or death, Hope found herself thinking about the strange turns that had brought them to this moment. 3 months ago, she had been a desperate girl carrying her dying brother across the desert with no hope beyond finding someone who might ease his suffering. Now she was part of a family that had faced down federal agents and escaped from one of the most secure settlements in the territory, bound for destinations that existed beyond the reach of any law but their own courage. The trail ahead wound through country so wild and beautiful that it seemed to belong to an earlier age, when the continent was young and unlimited possibilities stretched beyond every mountain ridge. It was dangerous territory that had claimed countless lives, but it was also the last refuge for those who refused to surrender their dreams to the crushing machinery of civilization. For a family that had already lost everything once, it represented the chance to build something new from the ashes of what had been destroyed. 7 years had passed since the night Hope Carson, Tommy Carson, and Nico Earthwalker disappeared into the high country above Copper Creek, and the settlement that had once thrived in the shadow of the territorial government's authority had become little more than a ghost story whispered around campfires. The federal raid that destroyed the mountain community had been declared a great success in the territorial newspapers, though few people bothered to ask what had become of the orphan children whose supposed knowledge of stolen bank money had justified the entire bloody operation in the remote valleys of the northern Rockies, where winter lasted 8 months and the growing season barely supported subsistence farming. A different kind of community had taken root. The Earthwalker Medical Station served a scattered population of miners, trappers, ranchers, and Native American families who lived too far from established towns to receive conventional medical care. The station consisted of a cluster of log buildings connected by covered walkways, with a main clinic, living quarters, and workshops where medicines were prepared using techniques that blended traditional Cahto knowledge with modern pharmaceutical innovations. Hope Carson Earthwalker, for she had legally taken the name of the man who had become her father in every way that mattered, stood in the clinic's main treatment room, carefully suturing a gash in the arm of a young Blackfoot warrior who had been injured in a hunting accident. At 18, she had grown into a striking young woman whose auburn hair and green eyes reflected her Irish heritage, while her gentle hands and intuitive understanding of healing arts showed the influence of 7 years under Nico's patient. "Instruction, hold still, Joseph," she said quietly, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone accustomed to treating serious injuries. "The cut is deep, but it missed the major blood vessels. You'll have full use of the arm once it heals properly." The young warrior winced as the needle passed through his skin, but his dark eyes never left Hope's face with an intensity that had nothing to do with his injury. Joseph Two Bears had been bringing various minor ailments to the medical station with increasing frequency over the past year, and Hope suspected his interest extended beyond her professional skills. It was a complication she wasn't quite ready to address, given the responsibilities that kept her focused on building the healing practice that served as their family's life work. "There," she said, tying off the final suture and beginning to wrap the wound with clean bandages. "Keep it dry for a week and come back if you notice any signs of infection. The payment is whatever you think the treatment was worth." Joseph reached into his leather pouch and withdrew $3 silver, more than most patients could afford, but consistent with his obvious desire to impress the young healer who had captured his attention. "My father wishes to speak with Nico about establishing a trading arrangement," he said, his English careful but clear. "Our people have access to medicinal plants that grow only in the high country, and we would value having reliable medical care for our children." Hope nodded, making a mental note to discuss the proposal with Nico when he returned from his current rounds. The medical station's success depended on maintaining good relationships with all the diverse groups that populated this remote region, and formal agreements with tribal leaders were especially valuable given the increasing tension between Native Americans and the territorial government. After Joseph left, Hope spent the afternoon organizing the clinic's medical supplies and updating patient records in the careful script that Nico had taught her to use for official documentation. The work was routine but satisfying, representing the kind of systematic approach to healing that could save lives when emergencies arose in country where the nearest conventional doctor might be hundreds of miles away. Tommy Carson, now 15, and nearly as tall as the man who had raised him, returned from his weekly supply run to the nearest trading post as the sun was setting behind the mountain peaks that surrounded their valley. The boy had grown into a serious young man whose slight frame concealed surprising strength, and whose quiet intelligence made him invaluable in managing the practical aspects of their isolated medical practice. He carried himself with the confident stride of someone who had faced genuine hardship and emerged stronger for the experience. "Any interesting news from civilization?" Hope asked as Tommy began unloading supplies from the pack mule that made these journeys possible. The usual complaints about territorial politics and Apache raids, Tommy replied, though his expression suggested there was more significant information to share. But there was also a stranger asking questions about our family. A woman from back east who claimed to be researching the fate of children who disappeared during federal law enforcement operations. Hope felt a familiar chill of apprehension at the mention of outsiders investigating their past. 7 years of peaceful existence had not erased the memories of Marshall Henley's pursuit or Agent Morrison's casual willingness to torture children for information they didn't possess. The federal government's interest in their family's fate should have ended with their disappearance into the wilderness. But bureaucratic curiosity sometimes outlasted the officials who initiated controversial operations. "What kind of questions?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady despite the anxiety that was building in her chest. She wanted to know if anyone had seen children matching our descriptions, traveling with a Cahto healer. She had photographs, Hope, old daguerreotypes, that looked like they might have been made from descriptions provided by people who knew us in Copper Creek. The implications were troubling on multiple levels. If someone was actively investigating their disappearance after 7 years, it suggested either renewed federal interest in their father's supposed treasure or concern about the controversial tactics used during the Copper Creek raid. Either possibility represented a potential threat to the peaceful life they had built in the northern mountains. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Multiple horses moving at a pace that suggested urgency, rather than casual travel. Hope and Tommy immediately took positions where they could observe the trail that led to their valley while remaining concealed behind the clinic's log walls. Years of living in remote country had taught them to be cautious about unexpected visitors, especially those who arrived after dark. The riders who emerged from the tree line were not federal agents or territorial marshals, but a group that Hope recognized with a mixture of joy and apprehension. Bridget O'Malley led the small party, her steel-gray hair now completely white, but her sharp blue eyes as keen as ever. Behind her rode Marcus Whitfield and 3 other survivors from Copper Creek's destruction, all showing the weathered appearance of people who had spent years living rough in mountain country. "Bridget," Hope called out, abandoning caution in her excitement at seeing the woman who had been like a second mother during their brief time in the mountain settlement. "How did you find us?" "Finding people is a skill that serves one well when living outside the law," Bridget replied with a tired smile as she dismounted from her horse. "Though I confess it took longer than expected to trace your trail through these northern ranges." As the group settled around the fire that warmed the clinic's main room, Hope listened with growing amazement to the story of Copper Creek's aftermath. The federal raid had indeed destroyed the settlement as a functioning community, but many of its residents had escaped into the surrounding mountains where they continued to operate as a loose network of traders, guides, and providers of services that the territorial government preferred to ignore. "We've been watching for signs of your family for years," Marcus explained, accepting a cup of the herbal tea that Tommy prepared using techniques learned from Nico's patient instruction. "Not because we blamed you for what happened. The feds would have found some excuse to attack us eventually, but because we wanted to know you had survived and found a place where you could build new lives. And now?" Hope asked, sensing that their unexpected reunion involved more than mere curiosity about old friends. Bridget's expression grew serious as she prepared to deliver information that would change everything once again. "There's been a development," That affects your family's safety. Agent Morrison, the federal investigator who led the Copper Creek raid, has been arrested for corruption and embezzlement. Seems he was skimming money from federal operations and using his position to settle personal vendettas against people who had crossed him in the past. What does that mean for us? Tommy asked, though Hope suspected he already understood the implications as clearly as she did. It means the charges against your family were probably fabricated, Marcus replied. Morrison needed a justification for the expensive federal raid, so he invented a story about missing bank money and children who possessed crucial information. The real James Carson probably died as poor as he lived, with no hidden treasure to recover. The news should have brought relief, but Hope found herself struggling with emotions that had been suppressed for 7 years. Their family had been torn apart, their community destroyed, and dozens of innocent people killed or displaced based on lies fabricated by a corrupt federal agent who needed to justify his actions to his superiors. The injustice was so profound that it seemed to demand some kind of response, though Hope wasn't sure what form that response should take. There's more, Bridget continued, studying Hope's face with the shrewd assessment that had made her such an effective leader of Copper Creek's refugee community. Morrison's arrest has created an opportunity for people with legitimate grievances against his operations to seek official redress. The territorial government is anxious to distance itself from his crimes, which means they might be willing to negotiate with families who were wrongfully pursued. You're suggesting we come out of hiding, Hope said, grasping the full scope of what Bridget was proposing. I'm suggesting you consider reclaiming your legal identities and the rights that were stolen from you, Bridget replied. With Morrison discredited, the charges against your family become legally questionable. A good lawyer might be able to get them dismissed entirely, especially given the lack of evidence supporting the original accusations. The conversation was interrupted by Nico's return from his medical rounds, the older man entering the clinic with the quiet grace that had characterized his movements for as long as Hope could remember. At 61, he showed the inevitable signs of age and hard living, but his dark eyes still held the gentle wisdom that had first drawn her to trust him during the darkest period of her childhood. Bridget O'Malley, he said warmly, embracing the woman who had been both friend and ally during their brief time in Copper Creek. It has been too long since we shared a fire and spoke of old times. As the evening progressed, Hope listened to the adults discuss the complex legal and practical implications of emerging from 7 years of self-imposed exile. The medical station they had built represented not just their life's work, but a genuine service to people who had few other options for medical care. Abandoning it to pursue legal vindication in distant territorial courts would mean leaving their patients without the treatment that often made the difference between life and death. But there were also compelling reasons to consider Bridget's proposal. Living under false identities meant constant vigilance against discovery, limited ability to travel or conduct business in established towns, and the ever-present possibility that their past would eventually catch up with them. Legal recognition of their innocence would provide security and opportunities that remained impossible as long as they existed outside official society. What do you think? Nico asked Hope and Tommy as the group prepared to settle down for the night in the clinic's guest quarters. This decision will shape the rest of your lives, and you are old enough now to understand the implications of whatever choice we make. Hope looked around the room that had been her world for 7 years, the shelves lined with medicines, prepared using knowledge passed down through generations. The treatment table where she had learned to heal injuries and illnesses that would have baffled conventional doctors. The windows that looked out on mountains that had become as familiar as the faces of her adopted family. This place represented everything she had learned about turning suffering into service, about finding purpose and helping others heal from wounds both physical and spiritual. I think, she said slowly, her voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone who had discovered her true calling, that we have something here worth protecting. But I also think we've spent enough years hiding from lies that should never have been believed in the first place. Tommy nodded thoughtfully, his young face reflecting the wisdom that came from experiencing both profound loss and unexpected redemption. Maybe there's a way to do both. Clear our names legally while continuing the work we've started here. Over the following days, a plan emerged that would allow them to pursue legal vindication while maintaining their commitment to the medical practice that served the Northern Mountain region. Marcus Whitfield, whose experience with document preparation had evolved into genuine legal expertise during his years of exile, would represent their interests in territorial court while they continued operating the medical station under protection of the legal proceedings. The process would be lengthy and complex, requiring testimony from Copper Creek survivors who could document Morrison's corrupt practices and the fabricated nature of the charges against the Carson family. But if successful, it would restore their legal identities and provide official recognition of the medical station as a legitimate healthcare facility serving an underserved population. 6 months later, Hope stood in the territorial courthouse in Denver, wearing the finest dress she had owned since childhood and feeling like an actor playing a role in someone else's story. The legal proceedings had attracted considerable attention from newspapers throughout the territory, partly because of the corruption scandal surrounding Agent Morrison and partly because of the unusual nature of a medical practice operated by a Cahto healer and his adopted children. The territorial court finds that the charges against Hope Carson, Thomas Carson, and Nico Earthwalker were based on fabricated evidence and false testimony provided by Agent Robert Morrison, the judge declared, his voice carrying the authority of official justice finally administered correctly. All charges are hereby dismissed, and the defendants are entitled to full restoration of their civil rights and legal status. The courtroom erupted in cheers from the supporters who had traveled hundreds of miles to witness their vindication. But Hope found herself thinking about the people who were not there to share this moment. Her mother, who had died believing her children might inherit her husband's criminal legacy. The residents of Copper Creek who had been killed or displaced. Defending a community that provided sanctuary for the innocent and guilty alike. Even Agent Morrison, whose corruption had destroyed so many lives in service of his own greed and ambition. "It's over," Tommy said quietly, taking her hand as they emerged from the courthouse into the bright Colorado sunshine. "No," Hope replied, her green eyes reflecting the determination that had carried her through 7 years of exile and uncertainty. "It's just beginning." They returned to the Northern Mountains with legal recognition that transformed their medical station from a hidden refuge into an official territorial healthcare facility. The vindication brought new opportunities for training, funding, and expansion that allowed them to serve even more patients throughout the remote regions where conventional medical care remained unavailable. Hope eventually married Joseph Two Bears in a ceremony that blended Cahto, Blackfoot, and Christian traditions, creating a union that symbolized the kind of cultural bridge building that had always characterized their family's approach to healing. Their children grew up learning multiple languages and healing traditions, carrying forward knowledge that might otherwise have been lost as the frontier era gave way to more settled times. Tommy became a respected physician in his own right, eventually establishing satellite clinics throughout the mountain territories while maintaining his connection to the original medical station that had shaped his understanding of healing as service to community. His marriage to a teacher from Denver brought formal education resources to the remote valleys where children had previously grown up without access to conventional schooling. Nico lived to see his adopted children become leaders in their own right, their success vindicating his decision to risk everything for 2 orphan strangers who had stumbled into his canyon sanctuary during their darkest hour. He died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 78, surrounded by the family he had chosen and the community he had helped to heal. At his funeral, people came from hundreds of miles away to pay their respects to the Cahto healer who had spent his life proving that healing was not just about treating symptoms, but about creating connections between people that transcended the barriers of race, culture, and circumstance. Hope spoke at the service, her voice carrying the strength and wisdom of someone who had learned that the greatest gift anyone could receive was the chance to transform their own suffering into service for others. He taught us that family is not something you are born into, but something you choose to create through love and sacrifice, she said, looking out at the crowd that included Native Americans, white settlers, Mexican vaqueros, and former refugees from a dozen different conflicts. He showed us that healing happens not just in the body, but in the spaces between people where understanding replaces fear and compassion overcomes prejudice. Years later, when Hope's own grandchildren asked her to tell them the story of how their family came to live in the mountains, she would begin with the same words that had started their journey. "Mom died last night. We've got nobody left." But she would end with the truth that had emerged from their years of struggle and growth. Sometimes the family you lose is replaced by the family you choose. And sometimes the greatest healing comes not from the medicines we brew, but from the love we're brave enough to offer to strangers who have nowhere else to turn. The Earthwalker Medical Station continued to serve the mountain communities for generations, its legacy extending far beyond the treatment of individual ailments to encompass a model of healthcare that recognized the connection between physical healing and social justice. In a world that too often saw medicine as a commodity to be sold rather than a service to be shared, it stood as proof that the ancient traditions of healing could adapt to modern times without losing their essential commitment to treating every patient as a member of the human family deserving of dignity, respect, and care.
Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.